Good morning, everybody. I'm Charles Shapiro, President of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. Good evening in China to those of you who are joining us from China. Our program today is The View from Beijing. Our guest is David Rennie, the Beijing Bureau Chief for the Economist magazine. Our program today is brought to you by the members of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, and thank you all who are members. I want to welcome two of our board members, Eric Joyner and Joe Bankoff, as well as Ambassador Louise Blais, the Consul General of Canada in the Southeastern United States, Wayne Lord, my predecessor as President of the Council, and Dr. Yawei Liu, Director of the China Center at the Carter Center. At about 11 o'clock in 30 minutes, we'll start taking questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function, but the Q&A. It's on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And please keep your questions short and use your name. I won't ask it if you submit an anonymous question. This is the third time we've hosted David Rennie. First time was here in Atlanta when he was the Washington correspondent. I think you were the White House correspondent of the Economist. We spoke to him 18 months ago when he was in Beijing. And in that time, China has only become more important to the rest of the world. And we appear to be on the verge of a Cold War with China. So David Rennie, welcome very much. It's a pleasure to have you back.
Good to be back.
I was telling you before we let the audience in, yesterday the Carter Center hosted a discussion with Chaguan, the relatively newly arrived Chinese ambassador to the United States. And he was very assertive and rejected any criticism of China and asserted that China is a democracy and a better democracy than the United States. What's going on? What's this about? Has China turned some sort of corner in its self-perception?
I think it probably has. So this is my second posting in China. The first time I was here, 1998 to 2002. Back then, you could have a conversation with a Chinese diplomat and they would, if you really push them on some question of human rights or push them on some question of sort of democratic accountability, free press, they would sort of sometimes say, well, those are all valuable things and individual liberties are kind of something that everyone should aspire to, but this is a large, still poor country. People don't have a lot of education. It wouldn't be kind of responsible to suddenly overnight kind of, unleash the forces of democratic politics. And so, it needs a firm hand. And I remember at the time, sort of saying it was a bit like they sort of presented human rights as like sort of color TV or air conditioning. It was something that you had to reach a certain level of wealth. And there was a sort of, the most assertive it got was to say, we have our system with all of its flaws and it's appropriate to our level of development. And you have your system and that's appropriate to your level of development. And why can't you kind of be more patient and give us some respect? That was the line 20 years ago. So then in 2002, I left and went off to do various postings in Washington and Brussels and came back in 2018 to China to find an extraordinarily changed China. The economy was 14 times larger than when I left, and that has an impact. This is a country which is extremely keen on what political scientists call output legitimacy. So there's this idea that a government can have input legitimacy, a mandate that it gets most obviously from an election, or it can point to output legitimacy. It can point to its great work, its high-speed trains, its growing economy, people's rising standards of living, and say, this is what counts. This is why we have a mandate to be your government. And most governments kind of juggle the two. They have some sort of mandate, they've had an election either freshly or some time ago, and they try and produce a better life for their people. China is an experiment in if you turn output legitimacy up to 10 and input legitimacy down to somewhere close to 0. And that kind of defensive, why can't we all respect each other's differences that I had 20 years ago, has been replaced by what you heard from Ambassador Chaguan yesterday at the Carter Center, which is a much more offensive argument that if you're measuring the success of a political system by output, by outcomes, by performance legitimacy, to use another term from political science, they would point to the north of 600,000 dead from COVID in the States. They would point to partisan gridlock in Congress. They would point to the insurrection on Capitol Hill on January the 6th. They would point to the chaotic departure from Kabul. The list is long. And they would say, how dare the American political classes even pretend to deliver good political outcomes and governance for their people? America is a decadent, declining, aging, selfish, individualistic, dysfunctional oligarchy where elections are bought by the rich and they pretend to consult the people once every 4 years, but the fix is in, and they can't even keep their own people safe. And every night on Chinese state television, after the first item on the news, which is some state leader giving a speech or inspecting some sort of farm, item 2 on the news is almost invariably chaos in the West. So it might be an anti-lockdown rally, it might be an anti-mask rally, it might be scenes of violence in some Western democracy. And the message is that China's political system is not just good for China, it is the finest, highest performance political system in the world. And that America is outrageous to even dare to criticize. And I think the aggression and the self-confidence that you hear from Xinjiang reflects something real, which is an absolute impatience now with being criticized. And it also reflects a tactic, which is this language that they use about our democracy is superior to yours, our human rights are superior to yours, our system of government is superior to yours. They're trying to make language almost meaningless. I mean, it's an old Soviet trick, but you define democracy so loosely and you tackle all these terms like human rights so loosely that no one really knows what to believe anymore. And I think that this has tremendous resonance for many Chinese people because they look at rising living standards and they look at the fact that COVID has basically been eliminated within the borders of this country, that the price they pay is an extraordinarily strict lockdown wherever there's an outbreak, and also that the borders are basically closed. I've not left this country since January 2020. It would be very, very difficult for me to get back in if I did leave, so I have not. And I live in a kind of China-sized bubble. And there are extraordinarily few foreigners in China right now. There are no foreign tourists, essentially no foreign students, a very small expat population. And that seems to, for the moment, suit this China pretty well.
And I imagine that state-controlled social media and state-controlled communications in a country the size of China, helps propagate that worldview, no?
Yeah, so it's dangerous to say that, it's dangerous if people assert that the Chinese public is either brainwashed or, would rise up against their government if only they could. And I think, sometimes I hear politicians in the West talking about, I don't have a problem with the Chinese people. They're on our side. They yearn for liberty.
David, you're frozen. So let's just stop for a. Okay, now it looks like you're back.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this place this place studied the fall of the Berlin Wall, and they studied the fall of the Soviet bloc very intently. And they heard Westerners saying this is because the human soul yearns to breathe free. And the Chinese Communist Party took a different view. Their view was that the Berlin Wall fell because people wanted Volkswagens and bananas and the right to foreign holidays. And if you give the people of China Volkswagens and bananas and the right to take foreign holidays, then actually they will tolerate a life that is unfree. And so you're right that there is tremendous censorship. And so it's very difficult to say that the Chinese Communist Party has informed consent for this social contract where they let people get rich and have material goods in exchange for giving up their liberties, because the Chinese Communist Party doesn't allow the Chinese people to know everything that's going on. There are cover-ups. There is tremendous censorship. Everything bad gets kind of immediately deleted, and anyone who keeps posting stuff that offends the party gets detained. But it's too glib and too easy to say that the people of China are chafing to overthrow their government and that they yearn for liberty, because this nationalist, this ethno-nationalist project, this majoritarian project that aims, as Xinjiang explained to you, to deliver kind of the most amount of benefits for the largest number of people, whilst not having any respect for individual rights, the difference between a majoritarian system and an individual democratic system. But this majoritarian compact with most Chinese people is actually pretty popular. And certainly the idea that the alternative is chaos and selfish individualism, I'm afraid to say, as someone who's lived in America for 9 years, loves America dearly, America looks really, really bad to most ordinary Chinese who look at people refusing to have vaccines or wear masks or punch-ups in school boards because of some mask mandate. And they buy the argument that the West is in kind of irreversible decline, born of selfish individualism, that it's decadent. And that, I'm afraid, resonates.
A month ago, all we were talking about was Afghanistan and the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I can imagine that's part and parcel of what you're talking about, that viewed from Beijing, that shows the decadence of the United States. I mean, what's the impact of that, both inside China and on the countries on the China's periphery in Taiwan and Vietnam and even South Korea?
So there's two important separate questions. So China, of course, leapt on the chaos in Kabul. Their message was not just America is leaving in a hurry, not just that America is selfish and looking after Americans and leaving its Afghan allies to suffer. They went further. They said, this goes to show that America's desire to impose American values on the rest of the world at the point of a gun, a wicked act of murderous folly, and that Afghans are paying the kind of blood-drenched price for that folly. And when the Americans finally had it driven into their stupid heads that this was a folly, they leave.
I think we've lost David, and hopefully he's going to come back. He's got an unstable connection, obviously. And I don't know how to sing, but this is extraordinary conversation. Well, I'm going to make an editorial comment here for a minute while we're waiting to get David back. And that is what he's describing, the Chinese, certainly the Chinese diplomats' attitude, is exactly what I have been hearing for 30 years. Oh, and you're back. Good. Your voice is back.
I'm very sorry.
No, it's okay. You're obviously your connection is unstable.
It's because to connect to Zoom, I have to use a VPN, a virtual private network, because I can't get it through the usual Chinese internet, and the VPNs are very unstable because they try and block them.
Good. Well, welcome back. You were talking about Afghanistan, and they're
So basically
Afghanistan and abandon our allies.
Exactly. And so this was the argument that, and I think you want an example of how extraordinarily aggressive the foreign ministry is right now. On September the 11th, at the foreign ministry's daily press conference, a wire reporter asked the spokesman of the foreign ministry, it's the 20th anniversary of 9/11, do you have anything to say? A question asked in probably foreign ministries in major capitals across the whole world. And most countries, including Russia, for example, managed to say, well, it was a great tragedy and our sympathies go to the American people. The Chinese foreign ministry spokesman said, well, we would like to talk about the fact that America's hands are dipped in blood and that Afghanistan is proof that America's foreign policy is a disgraceful crime against humanity. I mean, words to that effect. They don't back away from that. Now, you then asked another very important question, which is, do America's allies look at America's departure from Afghanistan and conclude that America is no longer a reliable partner? I mean, to some extent, clearly, they need to understand the politics in America of what is going on, why Joe Biden felt the need to withdraw the troops when he did. And I think clearly you'd be very naive if you were the Koreans or the Japanese or the Taiwanese, if you did not realize that something important has changed in American public opinion over the last several years, and that the American public is broadly done with spending blood and treasure fixing other bits of the world that look unfixable. And so I think if your bet is that your safety depends on the American public being willing to send their sons and daughters to defend your liberties, right now, that's a bad bet. And so, the Afghan people discovered that the American public was no longer willing to, after 20 years and trillions $1 trillion, was no longer willing to try and fix Afghanistan. Now, does that mean that America would not defend its allies in Asia? I think you need to realize that the reason that America probably still, I think, can be counted on to defend its treaty allies in Asia, which would be Japan, the South Koreans, and the Philippines, and to defend its allies, not quite as much as a treaty defense relationship with Taiwan. That's got nothing to do with the American public caring about the Taiwanese people or the South Korean people. I suspect, having worked in America for 9 years, that a significant number of Americans probably could not tell you the difference between Thailand and Taiwan and think that a Thai restaurant is Taiwan. I mean, so that's not what's going to keep Taiwan safe. I think what may keep Taiwan safe is the idea that if America did not turn up, say if there was a Chinese military blockade or an adventure or certainly an invasion of Taiwan, that if an American president at that point decided that America actually has no business getting involved in the security affairs of Asia and just doesn't turn up, then I think we understand that the world changes at that moment in an extraordinarily significant way. And that everyone realizes that this is a different world. And at that point, China's, feels extraordinarily kind of liberated to be the regional hegemon, if not a global hegemon. And so I think that the reason that Afghanistan should worry America's allies is because it tells you something very, very important about American public opinion and American politics. But I think that it's not a perfect analogy because America's vital national security interests and what the world thought of America was not really bound up intimately with what happened in Kabul. Kabul, unfortunately, the tragedy of Afghanistan is that for now, its problems seem to mostly be within the borders of Afghanistan, whereas America's kind of word as a security guarantor in Asia is still, I think, a higher level of vital national interests for the United States. But the 4 years of President Donald Trump should teach us that very few things about how America views its vital national interests overseas are kind of carved in marble. They're much more political and perhaps fragile than the pre-Trump world realized. So
if you add on to that, last week's announcement of the Australia, UK, US agreement to provide Australia with nuclear-powered attack submarines, how does that fit into the equation there?
Look, I think it's a really important note. Now, 8 submarines or a dozen submarines, which it might eventually be, isn't going to transform everything. But what are those submarines?
And they're not going to be deployed until 2040.
And they're not going to be deployed for another decade at least. And the Americans might lease some nuclear submarines to the Australian Navy first. But I think what it told you is something important. That the submarines that France was offering to sell to the Australians, these very quiet, very sophisticated diesel-electric submarines, if your mission as the Australian Navy is to defend the shores of Australia, then those French submarines are really, really good for that job because they're very quiet. They can stay underwater for 2 weeks at a time. They're very good submarines. What they're not good at is going into the deep ocean and patrolling the South China Sea or lurking off Taiwan to make the Chinese Navy wonder whether its aircraft carrier is within range of an American ally. And for that, you need nuclear submarines that can stay submerged for 2 months, that their strength is in deep water. And so the fact that Australia was willing to risk this diplomatic bust-up with the French was not just about whether they prefer America to France. It was a really deep strategic decision that the role of the Royal Australian Navy is to be a partner of the United States in deep water, far from Australia's shores, in the heart of the Indo-Pacific, as a deterrent against Chinese aggression. And the fact that the Australian government, partly I think in clear response to some of the economic coercion that Australia has been subjected to by the Chinese over the last couple of years, that shows you that the world is changing. And I can tell you that here in Beijing, what's been very interesting this week, and it's the column I just filed for this week's Economist, is that the Chinese reaction was actually quite cautious. They had a rather technical reaction about how this was a danger to nuclear non-proliferation because this kind of transfer of technology, even if it's just the reactor that propels the boat, it's not a weapon, it's very highly enriched uranium. How can you tell the North Koreans or the Iranians that they can't have similar highly enriched uranium if you're giving it to a non-nuclear weapon state like Australia. So, the Chinese rolled this line out. It's a pretty technical kind of objection. And they didn't kind of go all guns blazing and, stand on the side of the French, say that the Americans had destroyed the alliance system. And I think what that reflected was Chinese caution that actually the Chinese worldview, which is ultimately based on fairly bleak, kind of Hobbesian, kind of Congress of Vienna kind of analyses about international balances of power. For the Chinese, the spectacle of the Australians deciding that they would rather be the junior partner of the Americans than an equal partner of France, kind of two mid-sized powers together. From the Chinese perspective, that is, okay, so this America that we despise in terms of its domestic governance is still extraordinarily potent as a high-end security player, and it is having some success in forming alliances and coalitions to contain China. And that alarms China and it enrages China, that this decadent, declining, aging, selfish ex-hegemon is still so strong in certain fields, whether it's military or some forms of high technology or the US dollar and its extraordinary influence in terms of global finance, to the rage of this rising, hubristic, yet paranoid China. America still has the power to do real harm to China if it sets out to do that. And I think one thing that is increasingly clear to me after 3.5 years back in China is that there is a consensus at the top of the Chinese machine that America is not willing to let China rise, that America, in China's view, is too racist and selfish and unimaginative to understand China's magnificent superiority. But either way, their conclusion is that America is bent on thwarting and containing China's rise. And to their fury, in certain sectors, America still has tremendous strength. And so this AUKUS deal, I think, was taken very, very seriously in China.
Wow. So I was going to ask you, my last question was going to be if a Cold War is inevitable, but it sounds to me like you're saying we're already in the midst of one.
Well, we are and we're not. I mean, one of the things that I probably said to you the last time I spoke to your audience, and I apologize if some of them are the same people. I mean, if they have to watch me twice, I apologize. But I think I said to you last time that the thing that makes this so hard is that the old Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States and its allies was an ideological and a military Cold War. And that was already bad enough. But it was not an economic conflict. In the late 1980s, I think it was 1987, I ran the numbers once, total two-way trade between the US and the Soviet Union was $2 billion a year. Mm-hmm. The last year before COVID disrupted global supply chains, total US-China two-way trade was not $2 billion a year. It was $2 billion a day. And so you see that this is, yes, an extraordinarily dangerous clash of political systems with a China that is rising, is very impatient about being criticized. But it is also a gigantic trade partner whose supply chains are utterly invaluable to some of the most important American companies. It's not just the goods on our shelves are made in China. General Motors sells more cars in China than it does in North America. Apple, without its suppliers in China, would not be able to produce its iPhones. And so China is this new thing that we've never tried, which is an ideological adversary that is also our indispensable trade partner and is also the only power that can, with America, fix certain global challenges, whether it's climate change or hopefully fighting the next pandemic. And, we never let the Soviet Union we didn't trade with the Soviet Union. We basically sold them some wheat. We didn't buy their cars. We didn't buy their computers. No one said, should we let the Soviet Union build our telephone network? Yet there are Chinese companies that would like to do that for us. No one said, should we buy the Soviet Union's medical devices or vaccines or airliners or cloud computing systems? And no one said, how do we fix the next pandemic? We better do this with the Soviet Union. the problems of the 21st century globe are so large, some of them, that only China and America together can solve them. But right now, when people like John Kerry, the climate envoy, go to China, he's been twice now, the message he has had from the Chinese is, no, until you make it worth our while to engage with you on climate change, we're not talking to you, because you keep criticizing us about things like the crushing of the democratic opposition in Hong Kong or our human rights policies in Xinjiang. And so as long as you do that, we have absolutely no interest in talking to you about climate change, that you don't deserve that kind of engagement with us. And so this is a new China that is saying, yeah, we'll engage with you if you make it worth our while by ceasing to criticize us on any important point. And that is an extraordinarily difficult China to deal with.
Western politicians talk about compartmentalizing. We can disagree on this issue, but cooperate on another issue. And what I hear you saying is the Chinese are saying, no, that's not correct. That
who knows? That may be a negotiating technique. I mean, they are master negotiators, and when they want to compartmentalize, they will compartmentalize. If there's stuff that the world has that China needs, it will ignore any number of other disputes. But right now, the Chinese see an advantage. I mean, when Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, had their first meeting with their opposite numbers on the Chinese side, if you remember, in Anchorage, in Alaska, in March of this year, the Chinese basically handed them lists that said, these are the things that America does that we find intolerable, and they must stop, otherwise we have nothing to say to you. And when Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State, was in Tianjin for a meeting a few weeks ago, they handed her more lists and said, until you resolve these issues, we have no interest in speaking to you. And so finally, President Biden phoned Xi Jinping, who he knew reasonably well, because as vice presidents, they had deliberately spent time together to kind of get to know each other. But the call was not great. As far as we can tell, basically the Chinese message was the same. It's, we are not ready to engage with you as you wish, and you better come back with a better offer. And that is very difficult for the Joe Biden approach, which is to say, as you say, we want to compartmentalize. We want to talk about climate change, but we're going to criticize you on Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And China is saying, no, that deal doesn't appeal to us right now. And China's behavior to date suggests that they think they have time on their side.
Angela Cassidy asked about China's perception of President Biden. Has U.S. image improved or diminished since President Biden took office in January?
No. So the Chinese, I spoke to the Chinese reasonably extensively about what they thought of President Trump, and basically, perhaps to the surprise of some of your audience, they quite liked President Trump, because President Trump didn't care about Xinjiang or Hong Kong or Taiwan or human rights or Chinese industrial policy or protectionism. He thought all that was swell, and he told them so. And they recognized that President Trump was a fundamentally transactional figure who wanted China to pay more for the privilege of their relationship with America. And that was a kind of deal that the Chinese understood. And they liked the fact that President Trump thought of the world as there are big, strong countries and small countries that should do as they're told. That's China's view too. So they had some hopes. What they disliked intensely was some of the people around President Trump. Particularly, they hated Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and they hated some of the speeches that Mike Pence made as vice president, which seems to say that the problem with China is that it's run by a communist party. And towards the end of the Trump administration, some of the statements and speeches made by, for example, Mike Pompeo, seems to basically hint that until the Communist Party was swept aside, America could not have a good relationship with China. And that the Chinese absolutely detested. So they were relieved when the Biden administration came in, and they assumed that some of these people would be more professional, would be less kind of fixated on things like regime change. But their line right now is that they are deeply disappointed that many of the sanctions or tariffs placed on China and Chinese companies by the Trump administration have not been dismantled by the Biden administration. They also are very scornful of Joe Biden. He's he's a relatively known quantity to them because they knew him as vice president and he came to China quite a bit. The line that you hear from Chinese scholars and even off the record from Chinese officials is that Joe Biden is a symptom of America's decline, that he only just squeaked out a win because of COVID, that he is old, that he is tired, that he is past it, that he can't control his own Congress, that the Republicans may well beat him hollow in the midterms and then take the White House off him. And so in the words of one pretty senior Chinese scholar who I spoke to this week, he said, Joe Biden is a weak transitional figure and we can't cut a deal with him. And to the Chinese, it's just another symptom of an American political system that is in total kind of decadent decay. That if someone like Joe Biden is your president, you're not a serious country. That's their view of him.
Oof, it's tough. Brian Jenner asks, will China use military force against Taiwan?
So I wish that the obvious answer was, of course not, because it would clearly be an astonishingly dangerous war, because America is, if not kind of bound by treaty to come and help, America has said that it takes Taiwan's defense extremely seriously. That's in American law. And so America could turn up. And certainly the American position is that you should not rule out that America will turn up. And therefore, that is why China should stay its hand. And certainly China's calculation about whether it should just take Taiwan is, would the Americans turn up? And if they did, could the Chinese inflict enough damage to keep the Americans far away? Could they make America spend enough blood and treasure that America chose not to fight the last American drop of blood? It should be unthinkable for that war to happen, because these are two large nuclear powers. And I don't think that it's going to happen right now. So, we saw several months ago some remarkable congressional testimony from the outgoing head of Pacific Command, saying that he thought that there was a kind of real danger of conflict over Taiwan quite soon. I think he put the number of sort of within 10 years on it. All I can tell you sitting here in Beijing is that I do think that if the Chinese Communist Party were about to invade Taiwan because it thought that its moment had come, that it would have to start preparing Chinese public opinion for the astonishing sort of isolation and economic hit that China would take, at least for a while, if it just invaded Taiwan. And instead of which, all of the kind of the high-level rhetoric here is about, celebrating 100 years of the Communist Party, looking ahead to the next kind of centennial target of becoming moderately prosperous in 2035, a fully modern, prosperous society by 2050. We're looking ahead to Xi Jinping's third term as Communist Party leader. It doesn't feel like a country that is preparing its people to kind of eat grass if that is the price of taking Taiwan. So I don't think that it's imminent, but I do very much worry that China believes that if Taiwan drifts away in a way that is irreversible, that it would pay a high price to stop that. I mean, China's official position is that were Taiwan to declare formal independence, or were Taiwan to drift away sort of irreversibly, that China reserves the right to use force to prevent that. And I think that one of the things that makes the next kind of 10, 20 years very hard to read is that the passage of time works in two opposite ways from the perspective of Beijing. So with every passing year, if you were sitting in Zhongnanhai, the Chinese version of the Kremlin, Taiwan looks in relative terms weaker, and America looks in relative terms weaker and more isolationist. And so the passage of time means that the PLA's kind of chances of pulling off an invasion seem to go up with each passing year, because the PLA keeps building more ships and more submarines and more stealth fighters, and America looks less and less interested in being the global policeman. So in that way, that would be a kind of reason for patience, because the passage of time is in China's favor. But the problem is that if you look at Taiwanese public opinion and the hearts and minds of the Taiwanese people, particularly younger Taiwanese people, there's a whole generation of Taiwanese under 30, maybe under 40, for whom the mainland is not their home country. Maybe their grandparents came from the mainland, but to them it's this aggressive, weird, nationalist place that threatens Taiwan and flies planes around Taiwan. And the idea of kind of reunification with China on the basis of some promise of a high degree of autonomy and sort of one country, two systems, well, the people of Taiwan, they can see what happened in Hong Kong to Hong Kong's one country, two systems. And that was one of the reasons why the current president of Taiwan won re-election handily, having been way behind in the polls, was that her re-election coincided with the scenes of riot police clubbing school kids on the streets of Hong Kong, and then rewriting election rules to make it impossible to be a democratic opposition in Hong Kong, basically trampling one country, two systems. And don't forget that one country, two systems, that offer of a high degree of autonomy offered to Hong Kong, was actually originally crafted by Deng Xiaoping as an offer to Taiwan, that Taiwan would be allowed to remain capitalist, to have its own government, as long as it allowed kind of the highest levels of sovereignty to pass into the hands of Beijing. And so the fact that under Xi Jinping, China was willing to tear up and trample one country, two systems in order to maintain absolute political control over Hong Kong was basically a repudiation of the Deng Xiaoping strategy of trying to woo Taiwan back into a peaceful unification with the mainland. And so that willingness to kind of admit that the peaceful route, doing it the nice way, no longer really looks very credible to the mainland. And they're willing to set that example in Hong Kong and not really care about the effect on Taiwanese public opinion. That's why, although I don't hear the war drums beating all around me here in Beijing, I'm not sanguine at all about how China thinks this will end.
Wow. We haven't talked about the economy yet. I mean, you've mentioned it as the output, right? But suddenly there's been this spate of articles in the Western press about Evergrande and the housing bubbles, and Chinese economy might go into recession for the first time in 30 years. How serious is that? What's your take on that?
So if you were talking to Qin Gang, for example, he would say to you, stay calm. This is about the Chinese economy being so strong that it can afford to take care of some pressing problems to do with rising income inequality, to do with over-leveraged companies, particularly in things like the property sector, which is Evergrande is basically a massively over-leveraged, indebted property developer. The tech companies that they've been reining in were basically, they got, in China's view, in the views of Xi Jinping and the party, they got too big for their boots. They thought that they were big enough to defy regulators, that they had more data, they knew more about the lives and the spending patterns and the travel of ordinary Chinese citizens than the Chinese Communist Party did. And at a certain moment, the party decided it was time to rein that in. Part of the Chinese analysis of why America and the other parts of the West are in trouble right now is that capital has become too big for its own good, has become arrogant, and has become too footloose, that it's not patriotic enough, that globalization left multinationals thinking that they were more important than any nation state. China has no desire to allow that to happen within its own borders. So what you are seeing is a Chinese government that, you know, when we write articles in the Western press, I mean, not the Economist, but others do, saying that Xi Jinping is about to destroy his own economy by taking these extreme by ratcheting up control in so many sectors, that this is a kind of conscious decision to take a massive hit to the economy and to sacrifice growth in exchange for political control. I think it's a bit more subtle. I think that they think that what they are gaining is long-term stability, social stability, and economic stability, and they're willing to take a short-term hit in order to teach business that it's there to serve the national interest, that its access to this extraordinarily, uniquely valuable market that is China's comes with a price, a political price, that when the Chinese Communist Party picks up the phone and tells you what to do, you jump and you do it. So that's what's going on. Now, are they taking some pretty big risks at the moment that they can manage this kind of into a soft landing, that they can, impose all these new curbs on Chinese business without it tanking the economy? They do think that. And I think that one thing that strikes me as a very interesting question is whether the Chinese Communist Party's extraordinary confidence that they are this kind of technocratic, a bunch of geniuses who know perfectly how to run the economy, because look at how it's grown over the last 40 years. And they haven't had a major financial crisis of the sort that the West went through in 2008, 2009. I think they believe that they've kind of cracked it, that they have reinvented the rules of economic gravity, and that they are so smart that they don't have to suffer one of those crises. But, you know, I'm old enough, I've been a foreign correspondent for 25 years now. I'm old enough to remember how cocky the West was in the run up to that financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And plenty of Western politicians, you know, thought they had cracked, you know, permanent growth. Remember the kind of the adulation of the, you know, Alan Greenspan and you know, this idea that the kind of the third way politics of Clintonian kind of, you let business rip, you tax the proceeds, and you redistribute it in a kind of soft social democracy. That kind of third way was a kind of permanent centrist majority. But it turned out that when the economy went south and people's houses were no longer worth as much as they thought they were, that actually there hadn't really been informed public consent for that kind of third way program of kind of Blairite, you know, open borders, multicultural, cool Britannia, you know, finance with the proceeds of a deregulated city of London. It turned out that lots and lots of British people and lots of American voters really hated all that stuff. And they didn't like immigration, they didn't like cool Britannia, and they didn't like globalization. And they then turned around and voted for things like Donald Trump and Brexit. So I have seen in my career that politicians are extremely good at looking at today's success and projecting that forward indefinitely and giving themselves all the credit. And all I can say is that I was present, as we all were, you know, at the moment that that music stopped in the West. China, to me, looks somewhat hubristic, that they haven't been through one of those crises. And so they think that they've got this kind of taped. Now, the collapse of the Chinese economy has been predicted many, many, many times over the last 40 years, and it hasn't happened yet. So they're not bad at this, but there is a kind of edge of hubris to what they're trying right now.
And in this huge attempt on, certainly in the United States and elsewhere in the West, to you know, diversify supply chains, to nearshore rather than offshore products, to bring manufacturing home. What I hear you saying is that's not had any impact, or you certainly can't see that in China.
It's really interesting. So 18 months ago, so as the COVID pandemic was a kind of few months in, I remember very, very clearly talking to the heads of multinationals here in China, going to kind of the European Chamber of Commerce, you know, reading reports by the American Chamber of Commerce. Everyone was talking about a wake-up call, that this was a kind of a lesson that the world was too reliant on China, that these supply chains where we were dependent on China for ventilators or antibiotic precursors, or the kind of the white astronaut suits everyone wore for kind of COVID, all of those things that we suddenly realized we were dependent on China, that we had to diversify, that never again would we allow ourselves to become so dependent on China. And so everything 18 months ago was about diversification. And then the Chinese economy came back to life more rapidly than any other large economy, and actually put on growth last year. And so for many multinational corporations, their China unit was their only profitable unit last year. And the revenues from their China unit sent back to headquarters kept some of those companies basically afloat, or at least kept their shareholders off, you know, the CEO's back. And so now, you know, into year 2 of this pandemic, it's really striking how that kind of talk of diversification and the idea of being too dependent on China, that is really gone now, except in some very specific sectors. And in fact, in some sectors, people are still investing here because this is the growth story for certain sectors. So, you know, that idea that the world was going to diversify away from China, it turned out that there isn't kind of an obvious other China for many sectors. You know, people went to Vietnam and they quickly ran out of places to build factories and hire smart workers. Cambodia, the same. Now, I think what we will see more of is sector by sector. Some of that will be kind of nearshore. So, you know, Mexico may pick up some of this, Canada may pick up some of this. But I do worry that some of the political promises that are being made aren't actually easy to deliver. So a classic one is President Biden who's trying to sell to the American public the idea that fixing climate change doesn't have to be as painful as the Republicans say, that this will actually generate amazing, well-paid green jobs, that maybe people will no longer be working in coal mines or shale gas and oil fields, but they'll be building wind turbines or they'll be installing solar panels. There'll be this kind of green bonanza. And in a competition with China, America's goal is to win the race to the kind of the green, clean technologies of the future, so that there isn't a trade-off between climate change and economic growth and jobs. But that's not actually going to happen in the way that many listeners think when they hear something like that from Joe Biden, because the truth is that things like building wind turbines, solar panels, China owns that now. I mean, all of those, you're looking at 80, 90, 95% market shares from Chinese manufacturers. Those jobs, are going to be Chinese jobs. And what's really going to be difficult politics is that if the top priority of some Western governments is to tackle climate change by installing enormous amounts of renewable energy, then the jobs created, quite a lot of those are going to be in China. And we're going to have to decide as the world or as the West, do we care more about saving the planet or more about reshoring, old style manufacturing and taking it out of China? Because if that's in China now, that technology isn't particularly high-end technology. It's not viable in places like the States. So I worry that for very understandable political reasons, a story is being told in the West about the kind of the green jobs of the future, but it's not going to work exactly like that.
Wow. Sticking on climate change for a minute, President Xi Jinping, in his speech to the United Nations General Assembly, said that China won't finance coal-burning power plants outside of China. It continues.
We will not build new coal-fired power plants outside China.
Right. But in 2020, China built 3 times as much new coal power capacity as all the other countries in the world combined, and that it's equivalent of 1 large coal plant per week. How does China plan to deal with that? Are they ever going to be able to move away from coal?
So China says it will. China says it will peak its coal use and it will peak its carbon emissions by 2030, and it will be carbon neutral by 2060. Now that's later than others would like them to be. The European Union has said explicitly that if China is not peaked by 2025, that's not going to save the world from catastrophic warming. China is basically saying, we will do this and we will do it on our own timetable. And by the way, where's your plan? Why should we take lectures from you when you can't even get the smallest bill through Congress? So who are you to lecture us? China is very ambiguous because the top guy, Xi Jinping, has said that this will happen. And he said it many times. And he said that it is an existential threat to China, that China has a self-interest in doing this. And in the China of Xi Jinping, that is normally enough. But in the short term, as China tries to keep growth up, as China worries about unemployment and kind of growth levels and kind of the post-COVID recovery, you are right. They are still building new coal plants. They are lifting some of the restrictions on high carbon intensity production that they had imposed. Now, what we don't know is whether this is a kind of short-term kind of last gasp, that there are provinces and cities that hear the order to be peaking by 2030 and think, okay, we are going to grow as much as we can and pollute as much as we can between now and 2030, and then we'll be clean then, but not before, because every province wants to show good GDP numbers. And until recently on climate, a good description I heard from a Western climate negotiator was that China does the minimum of effort for the maximum of credit. And so, that has been the kind of disappointment of China. Good rhetoric, but, they tend to promise easy things that they were on track to achieve anyway, and then slightly over deliver and then demand praise. And that has been the pattern till now. So there is a lot of skepticism. If you're an optimist, you say 2 things. One, as I just said, the top guy, the big guy, has said it's going to happen, and that should be enough. And it is also true that if some of these new coal-fired power plants are very efficient and very clean, comparatively clean, and they remove old power plants from the fleet, then you can make a case that that will have some sort of impact as they head to peaking. But I mean, we see mixed messages. I mean, the other day, a week ago, 10 days ago, Xi Jinping went to Shanxi province, a kind of Rust Belt industrial province, and he toured a gigantic new plant that is making chemicals from coal. And, you know, that is the kind of thing that, you know, the West believes you shouldn't be building anymore. But they're just about to open this gigantic new plant. Now, it is state-of-the-art technology, but it's still fueled by coal. There are still gigantic coal mines in this country. And I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it's 57% of China's energy still comes from coal. And that's going to take a lot of weaning. And China's just so big that China's current carbon emissions are larger than the entire of the OECD put together. So although China is very resentful of being told that it should clean up more rapidly than any Western country achieved, the problem is China is just so big that unless China, you know, gets its act together, we're all going to cook, because China's increase of emissions, China's new coal plants, you know, they just absolutely eradicate the gains patiently made by, you know, some European country that closes all of its coal plants and installs lots of wind turbines. And then one Chinese province basically wipes away all of that gain. And so China is on the hook for this. And, you know, that's why we saw him make this statement about no more coal outside China. It's also not that hard to deliver that promise, because the truth is that Chinese state lenders had already started suffering reputational risks. Some of the biggest lenders, the biggest bank in the world, the Industrial Commercial Bank of China, had already said it was not going to have any new coal financing. Some of the big coal-fired plants in places like Africa or South Asia were already running into local political opposition. And actually quite a lot of those are on paper, and they're not actually being built right now. So Xi Jinping's promise, it was certainly better than the opposite, which was no promise at all, but it wasn't quite as big a kind of game changer as the world would like. What the world would like would be for China to turn up at the COP26 summit in Glasgow in October and say, we're going to have, you know, we're going to peak by 2025, which is Europe's demand of China, or we are going to cease new coal-fired production now, which would make a big difference. They don't seem to be ready to make that kind of an ambitious move just yet. And even the kind of politics of US-China that John Kerry, when he came to kind of plead with them to make that statement that Xi Jinping just made, they made it very clear that if America asks for China to do things in public, that makes it harder for China to deliver them, because China cannot be seen to be doing America's bidding, particularly when they would point to Joe Biden's inability to get ambitious climate policies through Congress, particularly after midterms, which, you know, the Chinese government, they don't like democracy, but they know how to read an opinion poll, and their bet is that the Republicans are going to sweep the midterms, at which point they assume Joe Biden's not going to get anything done. So they're not in the mood to be lectured about a man who they think is going to become the lamest of lame ducks.
Wow, you've given us a lot to think about, and we've almost used up an entire hour. Let me thank you so much. This has been an extraordinary conversation, David, and it's late, 11:30 p.m. in Beijing. So I want to thank you so much for spending an hour with us. I've got loads more questions. We got more that I'll send you from the audience that we didn't get a chance to ask. I hope you will come back and speak to us again. First of all, I hope you get all this sorted out with your family and visas and everything that's going on. But I hope you'll join us again and give us another update. This has really been extraordinary. You told me that you do an update on NPR. When is that? How can we listen to that?
So every other Friday, so tomorrow night, there's an NPR show called Friday News Roundup. I do the International Hour on that. It used to be the Diane Rehm show. It's now something called 1A. So I do that every other week on Fridays, which is from 11 till midnight. So I really must be a sucker for punishment, right?
You really are. Well, congratulations. Wow. Let me, thanks again, David. This has been terrific. And to our audience, thank you for staying with us and staying with us through the burp and the internet connection. I appreciate it. If you're not a member of a World Affairs Council where you live, please join. If you don't have one near you, please join the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. You don't have to live here in Georgia. You can have conversations with people like David Rennie without going to Aspen or Davos. I just think it's amazing. So please support World Affairs Council of Atlanta. We're going to post the video of this show on YouTube, hopefully in an hour, hour and a half. It depends on how fast YouTube is working. Please share it with your friends. We've got on Monday, the 27th at noon Eastern time, it's a members forum. So you have to be a member of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. And it's a Brexit update with David Young and Niall Walsh on UK post-Brexit. David Young is the CEO of Oxford Analytica, a risk analysis firm, does great work. Please join us on Monday. And then on Thursday, a week from today at noon Eastern time, we have Constanze Stelzenmüller from the Brookings Institution.
He's great.
She's fabulous. She's the best analyst of Germany in the United States. And we're co-hosting this, the American Council on Germany and the Halle Foundation. So please join us next Thursday at noon. I want to thank Valerie Lopez DeFrank, producer of the show, and welcome her back from her vacation. We barely survived without her. Thank Laura Brower, our social media and marketing manager, and Henna Rennie, executive producer. And above all, David, thank you very much. This has just been an extraordinary hour. I appreciate the time, your time that you have devoted to us.
It's a pleasure to do it. Subscribe to The Economist. If somebody subscribes to The Economist, that will be worthwhile.
They will. We all will. I promise that. Good. Thanks. Everybody have a good morning. David, good night to you.
Good night.
Thanks. Bye-bye.